What if everything you thought about how the government spends and taxes was, well, completely upside down?
Or maybe what if the rules that apply to your kitchen table budget or a corporate balance sheet just don't apply, not to a government that issues its own currency anyway?
That's exactly the rabbit hole we're diving into today. We've pulled together some really fascinating source material bits from academic textbooks on macroeconomics and modern monetary theory, plus articles digging into the actual plumbing of government finance, and some history, too.
Yeah, and these aren't just like abstract theories floating around. They offer a perspective on how sovereign currency issuers, like the US, for example, operationally function day to day.
It feels a bit like getting a backstage pass, doesn't it? Seeing
Yeah.
how the Treasury and the Fed actually work together behind the scenes.
Exactly. Beyond the headlines, beyond the political spin, just the mechanics.
So our mission in this deep dive is basically to cut through all that noise, pull out the key insights from these readings. We want to help you get a handle on these core ideas about how a government that, prints its own money really works.
Hopefully uncover some genuinely surprising facts along the way.
Yeah, maybe have a few aha moments that might just change how you see the whole economic picture.
Okay, let's unpack this operational reality then. Where do we start?
Let's start right at the beginning. The absolute ground floor. How does the government actually spend money according to these texts?
Yeah.
Because it's definitely not like me swiping my credit card.
Right, that's the crucial first point. For a government that issues its own currency, like the US, the Treasury, and the central bank, the Federal Reserve in this case, are operationally linked, they have to be, even if legally they're separate boxes on the chart.
You have to coordinate.
They absolutely have to coordinate. Think of them working in lockstep.
Okay, so when the government decides to spend maybe on a defense contract or sending out Social Security checks, what physically happens, where does the money come from?
Well, the sources explain it like this.
Hmm.
The Treasury essentially instructs the central bank, the Fed, to make the payment. The Fed then does a couple of things simultaneously. It makes an entry debiting the Treasury's account at the Fed.
Okay, like drawing down its balance.
Sort of, it's an accounting record. But crucially, at the same time, it credits two other accounts. It credits the commercial bank's reserve account at the Fed, and it credits the recipient's deposit account at that commercial bank.
Wait, hang on. So the central bank creates the funds in the commercial bank's reserves and in the recipient's checking account when the government spends. It's not like moving money that was already sitting in the Treasury's big account.
That's the core of it, yeah. The act of government spending is the act of the central bank crediting these accounts. New reserves pop into the banking system. New deposits pop into the recipient's account. The debit treasury account part is more like balancing the books internally, reflecting the government's instruction. But the money appearing in the commercial bank and the recipient's account is effectively new to the system at that moment.
Okay, that's big. So spending injects reserves and deposits. What about the flip side? Taxes. When I pay my taxes, how does that work? Does it just reverse the process?
It's slightly different initially. According to these texts, when you pay taxes, the money first often goes into the Treasury's accounts at commercial banks. They're called tax and loan accounts, or T&L accounts.
So the money is still sort of in the private banking system for a bit.
Exactly. For a short time, the reserves just move from your bank's reserve account to the Treasury's account within the commercial banking system. The total amount of reserves in the system doesn't change at that specific point.
But then the Treasury moves that money, right? It doesn't just leave it sitting in commercial banks.
Yeah. Right. Eventually, the Treasury transfers those funds from the T&L accounts at the commercial banks to its main account at the central bank. And that final step, that transfer to the Fed, is what actually drains the reserves from the commercial banking system.
Ah, okay. So the final settlement at the Fed is what removes the liquidity.
Precisely. The Treasury tries to manage these flows, coordinate the timing of tax collections moving to the Fed with its spending outflows to minimize disruptions. But the fundamental operation described is spending adds reserves, taxation ultimately removes them.
Okay, this is the first real mind bend from these sources. The core operational reality they're describing is that government spending creates the net money first, and taxation later destroys it. It's not taxes funding spending in a direct operational
Well,
sense.
it's almost the other way around, operationally speaking.
Spend first, tax later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about it logically, it kind of has to work that way. You need dollars to pay your taxes in dollars, right? Yeah. So where do those dollars ultimately originate? They have to be spent or lent into existence by the government sector before anyone in the private sector can have them to pay taxes with.
So the spending has to precede the taxing back.
That's the operational sequence they highlight. Spend or lend first, then tax or borrow back later.
Wow, that really does flip the script on how I usually think about government money.
Mm.
Okay, so if government spending injects reserves and taxation drains them, what happens if the government runs a deficit, spends more than it taxes over a period?
Well, just by definition, that process means a net injection of reserves into the banking system overall. More money credited via spending than debited via taxes ending up at the Fed.
What does the central bank do with all those extra reserves sloshing around? Before they started paying interest on reserves, wouldn't that have just pushed the overnight interest rate, or the rate banks charge each other, way down?
Absolutely. Historically, that was a major operational challenge. Banks with excess reserves would try to lend them out overnight in the federal funds market to banks that needed them. A flood of excess reserves would push the interest rate down, potentially towards zero.
So the Fed had to constantly intervene to keep the rate where they wanted it.
Exactly. If the Fed funds rate was drifting too low because of, say, deficit spending injecting reserves, the Fed would have to drain those excess reserves, usually by selling treasury bonds from its portfolio. If the rate was too high, maybe because taxes drained too many reserves that day, the Fed would inject reserves by buying bonds.
They were managing the quantity of reserves to hit their target price, the interest rate.
Correct. It was a constant balancing act based on reserve levels.
But the sources point out, and this is a big deal now, that paying interest on reserves changes the game quite a bit.
It really does. It simplifies things operationally for the central bank in many ways. If the central bank sets the rate, it pays on reserves the IOR rate at or very close to its target policy rate, like the top of the Fed funds target range.
Then no bank would lend reserves to another bank for less than they can get risk-free from the Fed itself.
Precisely. The IOR effectively acts as a floor for the overnight rate, especially when there are plenty of reserves in the system, which there have been since quantitative easing. Banks just park excess reserves at the Fed and earn the IOR, so the overnight rate naturally tends to settle near that IOR rate.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, as the outline hinted. These sources argue that because the Fed's primary goal is hitting that interest rate target, it actually has to accommodate the banking system's demand for reserves.
This is a really crucial insight from their perspective. To maintain its target interest rate, the central bank must stand ready to supply whatever quantity of reserves the banking system needs at that target rate, or drain reserves if there are too many, pushing the rate down below target or below IOR.
So the quantity of reserves isn't really the policy lever the Fed pulls. The interest rate is the lever.
That's the argument. The interest rate is the discretionary policy choice. The quantity of reserves becomes, in a sense, non-discretionary. It's whatever is required to make the chosen interest rate stick. The Fed isn't deciding, I'm going to put X billion reserves in today. It's deciding the target rate is Y%, and then doing whatever reserve operations are needed to keep the actual rate at Y.
So the Fed isn't rationing reserves or deciding who gets them. It's setting the price and meeting the demand at that price, like a price setter, not a quantity setter.
In essence, yes, that's the operational reality described. And because government fiscal operations spending and taxing are constantly hitting the reserve accounts, messing with supply and demand.
The Treasury and the Fed have to talk to each other constantly.
Exactly. Close coordination is essential to manage the impact of those fiscal flows on reserves and ensure the central bank can smoothly maintain its interest rate target day in, day out.
And this perspective, this focus on the Fed setting the rate and accommodating reserve needs, helps explain why those historical examples like massive deficits during World War II with near zero rates, or the big deficits after the 2008 crisis with low rates, or Japan's situation, why they didn't automatically lead to soaring interest rates.
Precisely. These sources argue it shows that short-term interest rates are fundamentally a policy choice of the central bank, heavily influenced by coordination with the Treasury, not some automatic market reaction determined solely by the size of the government deficit.
Policy drives the rate. Okay. That leads us neatly into thinking about the different ways money gets created. We've seen how government spending creates new deposits, and reserves effectively adding net financial assets to the non-government sector.
Right. Those are sometimes called vertical transactions, flowing between the government sector, Treasury Central Bank, and the non-government sector, households, firms, banks, rest of world.
And when we pay taxes or buy government bonds, we're using those existing government-created funds.
Yes. Taxes drain those net financial assets from the non-government sector. Buying newly issued government bonds is more like swapping one type of government liability for another, swapping non-interest-bearing reserves or bank deposits for an interest-bearing treasury security. It changes the composition of the non-government sector's assets, but not necessarily the net amount immediately.
So deficit spending, the net result of these vertical flows, directly increases the non-government sector's net financial assets, their net savings.
That's the accounting identity, yes. The government's deficit equals the non-government surplus, dollar for dollar.
Okay, but the sources also talk about banks creating money. How is that different? And how does it actually work, according to these texts? Because they seem to push back on the old banks lend out reserves story.
They absolutely do. That's another area where their explanation really challenges the conventional textbook view. They argue, quite strongly, that banks do not lend out existing reserves. They don't need to find a depositor first, take their money, and then lend it out.
So, where does the money come from when a bank makes a loan, if not from reserves or existing deposits?
Okay, picture this. A bank approves your loan application. At that moment, the bank does two things simultaneously on its balance sheet. One, it accepts your promise to repay your IOU and lists that as an asset. Two, it creates a brand new deposit in your checking account for the amount of the loan.
It just types the numbers into my account.
Essentially, yes. That deposit is a liability for the bank. It owes you that money on demand, but for you, it's a financial asset. It's money you can now spend. The loan creates the deposit.
Wow, so the money for the loan isn't transferred from somewhere else. It's created out of thin air, ex nihilo, by the act of lending.
That's the description. Ex nihilo might sound dramatic, but operationally the deposit is created through double entry bookkeeping when the loan asset is created. Reserves might come into play later. For example, if you spend that deposit and the funds move to a customer at a different bank, the banks might need to settle up using reserves. But the initial loan creation itself doesn't require the bank to have the reserves sitting there beforehand.
And these bank-created deposits, these checking account balances, that's most of the money we actually use day to day, right?
Overwhelmingly, yes. That's the vast majority of what we think of and use as money for transactions.
So you have this vertical money that comes from government spending, debt of taxes, and then horizontal money created within the private banking sector through lending.
Exactly. That's a common way they frame it. They see the horizontal money creation by bank deposits created by lending as leveraging the vertical or base money provided by the government sector. Bank liabilities, like checking accounts, function as money because banks promise convertibility into government cash, vertical money, on demand, and because they're accepted for payments, ultimately including tax payments.
Okay, this leads us to maybe the biggest, most counterintuitive point. If the government creates money when it spends, and banks create money when they lend, why does the government even need to collect taxes if it's not operationally needed to finance the spending?
Right. This is probably the single idea that causes the most double takes. These sources state it very clearly. For a government that issues its own sovereign currency, taxes are not operationally required to finance government spending, period.
Because of the spend first, tax later reality we talked about.
Exactly. You can't collect taxes in dollars until the dollars have been put into the economy by the government spending them first. Operationally, the spending finances itself through money creation at the central bank.
Okay, fine. But then, why have taxes at all? If they aren't funding the government's piggy bank, what are they for?
They serve several absolutely critical functions according to this view. First, and arguably most fundamental, taxes drive demand for the government's currency.
How so?
Well, if the government imposes a tax obligation, say, property tax, income tax, sales tax that must be paid in its specific currency, US dollars in our case, then everyone subject to that tax has a fundamental need to acquire those dollars.
So the tax liability creates a built-in demand for the otherwise potentially worthless government tokens. It forces people to need the currency.
That's a key part of the argument. The state levies a tax payable only in its unit of account. Then it offers to provision itself, buy goods, hire people, by spending that unit of account. People need the currency to pay the tax, so they are willing to work for the government or sell things to the government or sell things to others who work for the government to get the necessary currency. It bootstraps the whole system.
Okay, driving demand. What else?
Second, taxes reduce the non-government sector's purchasing power. They take money out of the hands of households and firms.
And why is that important if the government isn't using that money to spend?
Because by reducing private spending power, taxes make room for public spending without causing inflation. They free up real resources, labor, materials, factory time that the private sector would otherwise have commanded. The government can then use its spending to hire that labor or buy those materials without simply bidding up prices against existing private demand.
So taxes create real resource space. They manage the real economy, not the government's finances.
That's exactly the perspective. Taxes are a tool to manage aggregate demand, control inflation, redistribute wealth, and incentivize or disincentivize certain behaviors, not primarily a source of revenue for a currency issuing government.
And they mentioned historical figures thinking this way too.
Yeah, they often cite Beardsley Ruml, who was the chairman of the New York Fed back in the 1940s. He wrote a famous article basically saying federal taxes are obsolete for revenue purposes, but are crucial for managing the currency, controlling inflation, and influencing the economy. So the idea isn't brand new, though perhaps forgotten or ignored.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to another key concept these sources bring up. Sectoral balances.
Yeah.
You mentioned this briefly, the idea of an accounting identity.
Yes, it's pure accounting, but the implications are profound for how we understand the economy. It states that at the aggregate level, the financial balances of the three main sectors, the domestic private sector, households and businesses combined, the government sector, federal, state, local, and the external sector, the rest of the world, must sum to zero. Always.
Like a balance sheet. Debits equal credits across the whole system. One sector's surplus has to be another sector's deficit.
Precisely. They have to net out. So if the government sector runs a deficit, spends more than it taxes.
Then that deficit, by definition, must show up as a surplus somewhere else.
Exactly. The government's deficit equals the combined surplus of the non-government sectors, the domestic private sector plus the external sector. Dollars flowing out of the government faster than they flow back in have to accumulate as net financial assets for someone else.
And conversely, if the government runs a surplus taxes more than it spends.
Then it's draining net financial assets from the other sectors. This means the non-government sector, taken as a whole, must be running a deficit. It's mathematically impossible for the government to run a surplus and the non-government sector to also run a surplus simultaneously.
Okay, so think about this. Usually, the domestic private sector households, saving for retirement, companies retaining earnings, wants to run a surplus, right? They want to accumulate net financial assets over time.
Generally, yes. That's a typical desired state for the private sector in aggregate.
So if the private sector desires to net save, run a surplus, and let's say the country is also running a trade deficit, meaning the external sector is running a surplus relative to us.
Okay, so you have the private sector wanting a surplus and the external sector already running a surplus against us.
Then, for the accounting to balance, the government sector must run a deficit, right?
It absolutely must. The government deficit is the necessary counterpart to allow both the domestic private sector and the external sector to achieve their surpluses simultaneously. If the government tried to run a surplus or even just balance its budget in that scenario,
It would mathematically force the domestic private sector into deficit.
correct, the private sector